Have you ever noticed how some people speak about everything with absolute confidence? That person who always seems to have the answer, never hesitates, and shares strong opinions on topics like economics, politics, science, and philosophy, as if they've read every book out there. What's most interesting is that often, the less they actually know, the louder they speak. Schopenhauer observed this phenomenon over 150 years ago. And right now, you're probably surrounded by someone like this. The real question isn't whether they exist. It asks how you manage to stay sane around them. We live in a time when everyone feels pressured to have an opinion on everything. Just open any social media platform, and you'll find countless people arguing about subjects they just discovered minutes ago. But they aren't there to learn. They're there to win, to prove they're right. But do they truly understand? Or have they mistaken having a strong opinion for genuine knowledge? Schopenhauer said, "We're surrounded by small minds with big opinions." He wasn't being harsh, he was being truthful. Because there's a huge difference between thoughtful reflection and simply echoing what we hear around us. That difference is what separates wisdom from noise. Never before has it been so easy to have an opinion. In the old days, if you wanted to talk about a subject, you needed to study, read books, talk with experts, reflect for hours, or even years. Today, you just need 2 clicks, and you're done. You've already found 3 articles that confirm exactly what you already believed. And that's when the problem starts. Because the internet hasn't made us wiser, it's made us faster. And speed isn't depth. People feel obligated to have opinions about everything, about the war that started yesterday, about the economy of countries they can't even locate on a map, about diseases they haven't studied. And what's worse, they defend these opinions tooth and nail, as if they were absolute truths, as if disagreeing with them were a personal attack. Schopenhauer observed this with a mixture of contempt and fascination. He realized that this rush to have opinions came from the need to belong, to be seen, to have relevance. Because deep down, many of these inflamed opinions are nothing more than desperate screams for attention amid the silence of insignificance. And so we enter a vicious cycle, where staying silent is seen as weakness, when in reality it could be the wisest contribution of all. There's a curious phenomenon that Schopenhauer loved to point out. The people who know the least are exactly the ones who speak with the most certainty. Have you noticed this? That guy who read half a dozen headlines has absolute certainty about geopolitics. That person who watched 2 short videos has all the answers about health. And they don't speak with doubt. They declare, they affirm, they pronounce judgment. Meanwhile, the real experts, those who've dedicated decades studying a subject, usually speak with caution, with disclaimers, with nuances. Because the more you understand about something, the more you realize how much you still don't know. The deeper you go, the more you discover layers of complexity that were previously invisible. And this generates hesitation, generates humility, generates doubt. But doubt doesn't sell. Doubt doesn't win followers. So, small minds, precisely because they don't see the complexity of things, can offer simple, direct, and comforting answers. And people love this because thinking is exhausting. Accepting that the world is complicated, is uncomfortable. Much easier to embrace a simple explanation and move on. Schopenhauer called this the certainty of fools. That unshakable conviction that comes not from knowledge but from ignorance. Because when you don't know enough to understand the problem, you don't know enough to doubt the solution. And so humanity walks on, led by empty certainties pronounced in loud voices, while wisdom murmurs in the corner of the room. And nobody listens. Our modern society has a serious problem with depth. We live in a world that rewards speed above all else. Nobody reads a complete article anymore. People read the title, glance at the first paragraphs, and already jump to the comments. Nobody watches a full 30-minute video. People watch the first 3 minutes, speed through to the end, and think they understood everything. This constant rush has created a culture of superficiality. We want answers in 10 seconds. We want solutions in 3 steps. We want to understand complex problems through catchy phrases. And when someone tries to bring nuance and depth to the conversation, That person is labeled as boring, as someone who's complicating what should be simple. But reality isn't simple. Life isn't simple. Human beings aren't simple. And trying to force everything into small boxes and quick answers is an act of violence against truth itself. Schopenhauer saw how society was already beginning to value the appearance of knowledge more than real knowledge. And today we have algorithms that feed our rush, creating perfect bubbles where small minds cultivate big opinions without ever being truly challenged. So superficiality becomes the norm, the expected standard, even a virtue. And this is the fertile ground where big opinions bloom over small thoughts. While the world shouts, there's a group of people who prefer to stay silent, not because they have nothing to say, but because they've realized something fundamental. Most debates are useless. Most discussions don't seek truth. They seek victory. And when you realize this, silence stops being weakness and becomes strategy. Schopenhauer was a master of selective silence. He didn't waste time trying to convince people who didn't want to be convinced. He knew that some minds are impermeable to rational arguments, not out of stubbornness, but out of genuine inability to process certain ideas. And this isn't elitism, it's observation. There are people who simply haven't developed the capacity to think abstractly, to deal with paradoxes, to accept that two apparently contradictory things can be true at the same time. For these people, everything needs to be black or white, right or wrong. And when you try to introduce shades of gray, they accuse you of sitting on the fence. So deep thinkers learn to choose their battles. They learn to identify when it's worth speaking and when it's worth staying quiet. Because talking to someone who doesn't want to listen isn't communication, it's waste. It's throwing seeds on dry ground and expecting something to grow. And this choice of silence is awareness. It's maturity. It's understanding that there are moments when the best response is not to respond. Schopenhauer saw this as preservation of mental energy, of inner peace, of the ability to think clearly, because entering endless debates with those who don't want to learn only pollutes your own mind with someone else's mediocrity. When you start seeing beyond the surface, when you develop the ability to think critically, something inevitable happens. You become lonely. Not because you want to, but because most people simply can't keep up with your conversations, can't understand your concerns, can't share your restlessness. Schopenhauer lived this firsthand. He was a brilliant man in an era dominated by mediocre thinkers who were celebrated precisely for saying what people wanted to hear. Meanwhile, he who spoke uncomfortable truths was ignored, ridiculed, pushed away. And he realized this wasn't an accident. It was a pattern because society doesn't reward those who think deeply. It rewards those who speak beautifully. This intellectual loneliness isn't a conscious choice. What happens is that your conversations become increasingly difficult. You try to talk about something that truly matters, and you notice the vacant look on the other side. You try to share a deep reflection and get back a superficial comment. You try to raise a complex question and are met with a ready-made pre-wed answer. And gradually you start realizing that most people don't want to think. They just want to confirm what they already believe. And when you realize this, two options present themselves. Either you adapt and pretend to be more superficial than you are, or you accept loneliness as the price of lucidity. Schopenhauer chose the second option. He didn't give up, didn't lower himself because he knew that the loneliness of the deep thinker is infinitely better than the noisy company of the superficial. This loneliness forces you to develop a rich, complex, self-sufficient inner world. And this, despite being painful, is liberating. Let's get one thing straight. Having an opinion isn't the same thing as having knowledge. And knowledge isn't the same thing as wisdom. But most people confuse these three things as if they were one. And this confusion is the root of much of the intellectual chaos we see out there. Opinion is easy. Everyone has one. You can form an opinion in 10 seconds based on absolutely nothing, based on a feeling, an impression. And there you go. You have an opinion. It can be completely wrong, but it's still your opinion. And nowadays it seems like that's enough. Knowledge is different. Knowledge requires study, time, you absorbing information, processing it, organizing it. It's you knowing facts, understanding contexts, recognizing patterns. But still, knowledge isn't the top of the pyramid. Wisdom is something else entirely. Wisdom is when you not only know things but understand their meaning, understand the implications. Wisdom is having discernment. It's knowing when to apply knowledge and when to keep it to yourself. It's recognizing that not every truth needs to be told at every moment. Schopenhauer was obsessed with this distinction. He saw erudite people full of knowledge, quoting philosophers and theories but completely devoid of wisdom. People who knew everything about books, but nothing about life. Knowledge without wisdom is like having an entire library and not being able to read. And today, this confusion has reached absurd levels. People think that because they have access to information, they automatically have knowledge. And because they have knowledge, they automatically have wisdom. But it doesn't work that way. You can have all of Google at your disposal and still be a fool. Because information without context is just noise. Knowledge without discernment is just accumulation. And opinion without foundation is just noise. The world already has too much superficiality. Talking a lot doesn't mean understanding deeply. It just means you like the sound of your own voice. Think about how many times you've seen someone completely change their opinion about a subject overnight. Yesterday they were defending one thing. Today they defend exactly the opposite with the same intensity. And when you point out the contradiction, the person simply explains why they're right now, and were also right before in different ways. This happens because for many people, opinion isn't about truth. It's about performance. It's about playing a role. It's about fitting into a group. It's about gaining approval. And that's why these opinions change as the audience changes, as what's in fashion changes, as what's socially acceptable changes. Schopenhauer would call this the theater of public certainties, a great spectacle where everyone acts out convictions they don't always feel, where people repeat phrases they heard somewhere and pretend they're original reflections, where the same arguments circulate from mouth to mouth, slightly modified, but always maintaining the shallow essence that makes them easily digestible. And the theater has its rules. There are things you can say and things you can't. There are opinions that give you status and opinions that make you a pariah. It doesn't matter if these opinions are true or false. What matters is whether they're accepted by the group you want to belong to, because at the end of the day, for most people, belonging is more important than understanding. You can see this clearly on social media. The same opinions being repeated in the same circles with small variations in vocabulary, but maintaining identical structure, as if people had downloaded a script and were just performing it in their own words. And when someone dares to go off script, that person is immediately attacked because the theater doesn't tolerate improvisation. The performance only works if everyone agrees to maintain the fantasy, and whoever refuses to participate becomes the enemy. The crime isn't being wrong. The crime is not performing along. There's something frightening that happens when mediocre people get together. They become powerful. Not because they become smarter, but because they become louder, more organized, more confident. And in a world where volume matters more than substance, that's enough to suffocate practically any original idea. Schopenhauer watched with horror how organized mediocrity could destroy individual talents, how a group of ordinary people united by shallow but popular opinions could marginalize brilliant thinkers. And he saw that this wasn't the exception. It was the rule. Think about how many times you've seen someone trying to present a new idea, a different perspective, and immediately being bombarded by a group saying it doesn't work, that it's too complicated, that it's always been done another way. These people didn't analyze the idea, didn't try to understand. They simply rejected it because the new threatens the status quo that gives them comfort. And organized mediocrity is dangerous because it operates under the banner of normally. It says this here is common sense. It's what everyone thinks. It's what's always worked. And when you question it, you're not just disagreeing, you're being arrogant, you're trying to think you're better than everyone. What these people don't realize is that practically every human advancement came from someone questioning common sense. Practically every innovation was achieved by people who refused to accept what everyone accepted. But for everyone who succeeded, Hundreds were silenced, were ridiculed because organized mediocrity has a powerful survival instinct. It identifies threats and neutralizes them. And the best way to neutralize an original idea is to attack not the idea, but the person presenting it. Have you ever tried to explain something really important to someone who simply doesn't want to understand? It's one of the most frustrating experiences there is, because the problem isn't lack of clarity on your part. The problem is that the person on the other side isn't there to comprehend. They're there to win. Schopenhauer had a very clear principle about this. Never argue with someone who isn't seeking truth, because when someone enters a conversation already decided about what they believe, it doesn't matter what you say. You can present the best arguments in the world, the most solid evidence. None of it matters if the other person's goal isn't to learn, but to prove you wrong. And the exhaustion of trying to dialogue under these conditions is immense. You come out of these conversations mentally exhausted, emotionally drained, because it's not just about debating ideas. It's about dealing with bad faith, with intellectual dishonesty, with rhetorical tricks that don't seek truth, but only victory. Schopenhauer studied these tactics deeply. He even wrote about the dirty tricks people use in debates to win without being right. And the more he observed, the more convinced he became that most public debates are nothing but theater. Empty performance where nobody changes their mind, nobody learns anything. And what this does to those who truly seek truth is devastating, because you realize that being right doesn't matter. Having better arguments doesn't matter. If the other person isn't willing to consider they might be wrong, you're just wasting your time and your mental health. And there's an even more perverse aspect. These endless discussions contaminate you. They make you more cynical, more defensive, more closed off. Schopenhauer would say that protecting your intellectual energy is more important than convincing any specific person. That there are battles not worth fighting, not because you can't win, but because the fight itself diminishes you. That the risk of arguing with those who do not want to understand isn't just failing to convince the person. It's contaminating your own mind with someone else's mediocrity. And that's why he defended radical selectivity. Choosing who to talk with, choosing which debates to enter, choosing when it's worth spending energy, and when it's better to simply move on. Ignorance by itself isn't a problem. Everyone is ignorant about something. The problem starts when ignorance meets pride. When someone not only doesn't know, but is proud of not knowing. When someone turns their lack of knowledge into a flag. Schopenhauer was fascinated by this phenomenon. He saw people who not only refused to learn, but who boasted about it. People who said, "I don't need to study this, I already know what I think." Or, "That's all theory, real life is different." And what all these phrases have in common is pride in one's own ignorance. There's even a term for this, anti-intellectualism. It's when someone not only doesn't value knowledge but actively despises it, treats studying as a waste of time, treats thinking deeply as affectation, treats those who seek real understanding as pretentious. And these people manage to convince others they're right. Because there's enormous comfort in not having to think, in not having to question your beliefs, in not having to admit that maybe you don't know as much as you thought. It's much easier to simply decree that knowledge is superfluous, that intuition is enough. And when you find a group that validates this posture, you feel justified. Schopenhauer observed that the less someone knows, the more resistant that person is to learning, because learning requires humility, requires admitting you don't know, requires giving up comfortable certainties, and for someone whose identity is built on these certainties, learning is threatening. And so these people build walls increasingly higher around their ignorance. Each new fact that contradicts their beliefs is rejected. Each logical argument is seen as an attempt at manipulation. Each expert who disagrees is disqualified. And pride grows proportionally to ignorance in a spiral that only deepens the disconnection from reality. What makes this even more tragic is that these people aren't necessarily stupid. Many have potential intelligence, but they chose to protect their ego instead of developing their intellect. Chose comfortable certainty instead of productive doubt. And when these minds come together, When they form entire groups based on pride and ignorance, the result is a society that not only doesn't advance, but actively fights against advancement. In an era where everyone has opinions about everything, where social media amplifies any voice, doing one thing becomes almost revolutionary. Thinking for yourself truly without repeating what you heard, without simply adopting your group's opinion, without letting algorithms decide what you'll believe. Schopenhauer would say that thinking for yourself is the most courageous act there is, because it's much easier to just absorb the ready-made ideas circulating around you. It's more comfortable to accept the conclusions your parents, your friends, your idols have already reached. It's less risky to simply agree with the majority. But doing this isn't thinking, it's just echoing. And truly thinking hurts. It hurts because it forces you to question things that give you comfort. It hurts because it can lead you to conclusions that isolate you socially. It hurts because it requires you to abandon easy certainties and embrace uncomfortable doubts. But courage lies exactly there in being willing to think, even when it takes you to places you'd rather avoid. Schopenhauer observed that most people live inside mental boxes built by others and don't even notice. Think they're thinking when actually they're just rearranging furniture in a house they didn't build. Think they're being authentic when actually they're just choosing between pre-approved options. And breaking these patterns, developing real intellectual autonomy is a solitary and frightening process. Because when you start thinking for yourself truly, you stop fitting perfectly into any group. You see nuances where others see only black and white. And this makes you hard to categorize, hard to control, hard to manipulate. And precisely because of this, society doesn't encourage autonomous thinking. Society encourages tribal thinking, encourages you to choose a team and defend all that team's positions, encourages intellectual conformity disguised as loyalty. And when someone refuses to play this game, that person becomes uncomfortable. Schopenhauer faced this his entire life. His contemporaries expected him to align with some existing philosophical school, but he refused. He thought for himself, even when it meant being rejected, even when it meant loneliness. And he would tell you today, this courage is worth everything, worth the loneliness, worth the confrontation, because living with your own convictions, even if imperfect, is infinitely better than living with borrowed convictions. Thinking for yourself can isolate you, but not thinking for yourself erases you. We live in a culture that treats loneliness as a disease, as something to be avoided at all costs, as a sign that something's wrong with you. And because of this, people do anything to avoid loneliness. They accept bad company, maintain superficial friendships, frequent places they can't stand just to not be alone. But Schopenhauer saw loneliness completely differently. For him, loneliness wasn't a symptom of failure. It was a symptom of depth. Because when you think on levels most don't reach, when you worry about things most ignore, you inevitably end up alone. Not because something's wrong with you, but because something's too right. Think about it. If you value deep discussions about the meaning of life and most around you only want to talk about trivialities, you'll be alone in your reflections. If you question social norms and everyone around you follows them blindly, you'll be alone in your questioning. And this isn't pathology. It's the natural consequence of having standards above average. Schopenhauer went so far as to say that loneliness is the natural destiny of superior spirits. And before you think this is arrogance, understand people who think deeply are statistically rare. So it's mathematically expected that they'll be alone frequently. And what society doesn't understand is that for these people, loneliness isn't suffering. It's peace, it's relief. It's the chance to finally breathe without having to explain yourself, without having to simplify your thoughts, without having to fake interest in empty conversations. Loneliness for the deep thinker is like silence for the musician. It's not the absence of something good. It's the presence of something necessary. Of course, prolonged loneliness can be painful, but there's a huge difference between loneliness and isolation. Isolation is being disconnected even from yourself. Loneliness, especially the loneliness of the lucid thinker, is being intensely connected with yourself. It's having an inner life so rich that the absence of others doesn't create emptiness. Schopenhauer had an extremely rich inner life. He thought, read, wrote, reflected for hours on end. And these hours alone weren't wasted or sad hours. They were productive hours, necessary hours, hours that generated works that influence the world to this day. And this is important to understand. Loneliness as a sign of lucidity doesn't mean you should isolate yourself completely. It means you're not afraid of loneliness. It means you don't need constant company to feel whole. And that freedom, that ability to be well with yourself, is strength, not weakness. So yes, loneliness can be a sign of lucidity, can be evidence that you see more than most, can be the natural consequence of having developed beyond the point where superficial conversations still satisfy. There's a type of person who loves using difficult words, who loves quoting obscure philosophers, who loves demonstrating they've read books nobody else has read. And at first glance, these people might even seem deep. But when you pay real attention, you notice something. They're not wise, they're exhibitionists. Schopenhauer made a fundamental distinction between real wisdom and intellectual exhibitionism. Real wisdom is quiet, it's humble. Those who truly know don't need to prove they know, don't need to display knowledge like it's a trophy. Because true wisdom generates inner peace, not a need for external validation. Intellectual exhibitionism, on the other hand, is loud. It's performative. The person who exhibits intellectually isn't sharing knowledge. They're seeking admiration. They're trying to impress. They're using information as a tool for social status, not as a path to truth. Think of someone truly wise. You know, that person probably spoke with simplicity, explained complex things in a way anyone could understand, didn't use complicated vocabulary when simple words would do. Because real wisdom wants to be understood, not admired. Now think of someone who exhibits intellectually. That person probably complicates what should be simple, uses unnecessary technical terms, quotes more than they think. And when you don't understand, they don't simplify. They make you feel stupid because the goal isn't to communicate, it's to dominate. Schopenhauer saw this constantly in the academic world of his time. Professors who used obscure language, not because the subject required it, but because they wanted to appear profound, and he deeply despised this. For him, any intelligent person can explain complex ideas simply. If you truly understand something, you can translate it into accessible language. If you need jargon and elaborate vocabulary, one of two things is happening. Either you do not understand as well as you think, or you don't really want the other person to understand. In both cases, it's not wisdom, it's fraud. And intellectual exhibitionism isn't just irritating, it's harmful because it pushes away people who could benefit from knowledge, creates a false hierarchy, where those who know difficult words seem superior to those who think clearly, discourages ordinary people from seeking knowledge. Schopenhauer believed that true intelligence demonstrates itself through clarity, not obscurity. That true mastery of a subject shows itself through the ability to simplify, not complicate. That true wisdom seeks to share, not impress. So when you meet someone who speaks simply but profoundly, value them. When you meet someone who complicates unnecessarily, be skeptical because you're probably facing a performer who confused knowledge with spectacle. Imagine you spend years studying a subject. You read dozens of books, watch hundreds of hours of classes, reflect deeply, and finally you reach a well-founded conclusion. Then you share this conclusion. And what happens? Half the people attack you violently because your truth, however well-founded, bothers them. Schopenhauer understood this viscerally. He saw how certain truths are rejected not because they're false, but precisely because they're true. Because uncomfortable truths threaten comfortable beliefs, threaten identities built on lies. And when you threaten these things, it doesn't matter how correct you are, you'll be attacked. Think about how many obvious truths people refuse to accept simply because accepting would be painful. The truth about their own mistakes, the truth about people they love, the truth about their own mortality. These truths are there screaming, but people develop an impressive capacity not to look. And when someone forces these people to look, when someone points out truths they spend energy trying to ignore, the reaction isn't gratitude, it's anger. Because you're not just presenting a fact, you're destroying a psychological defense. You're removing a blindfold the person put on purposely. Schopenhauer lived this firsthand. His truths about human nature, about suffering, were too uncomfortable for his era. People wanted to believe in inevitable progress in essentially good human nature. And he came along saying, no, life is essentially suffering. Human beings are driven by irrational wills. Was he right? In many points, profoundly right. But that didn't matter. What mattered is that he was saying things people didn't want to hear. So he was ignored, ridiculed, not for being wrong, but for being too right for others' comfort. And this happens at all levels. Happens in relationships where truths about toxic dynamics are rejected because accepting would mean having to break up. Happens in societies where truths about injustices are denied because recognizing would mean having to reform. The mechanism is always the same. Truth threatens the ego or comfortable belief. So the ego defends itself by attacking not the truth but the messenger. Schopenhauer concluded that some truths will never be popular, will never be widely accepted, not because they're false but because they're too hard. And those who dedicate themselves to seeking and speaking these truths need to be prepared to be rejected. Because in the end, there's a choice every deep thinker needs to make. Do you want to be loved or do you want to be honest? Do you want approval or do you want truth? And if you choose truth, you need to accept that some truths will cost you relationships, opportunities, social peace. And Schopenhauer would say, it's worth it. Think of your life as a house and your mind as the most important room in that house. Now imagine letting just anyone into that room. People who will dirty it, mess it up, break things, leave marks that will take years to clean. Would you do that with your physical house? So why do people do this with their minds? Schopenhauer understood something fundamental. Not every mind deserves access to your thinking. Not because you're arrogant, but because your time, your energy, and your mental clarity are precious and limited resources. And wasting these resources on people who don't have the capacity or interest to understand what you have to say isn't generosity. It's waste. This doesn't mean you should be closed off or unpleasant. It means you should be selective. Just as you don't tell your deepest secrets to any stranger, you shouldn't share your most important reflections with just anyone who crosses your path. And knowing who to talk to is wisdom as important as knowing what to say. You can have the most brilliant idea in the world, but if you share it with the wrong person, that idea will die right there. Or worse, it'll be distorted, ridiculed, used in ways you never intended. Schopenhauer was extremely careful about this. He didn't waste his reflections on just anyone, not because he thought himself superior, but because he understood that certain conversations require a level of intellectual and emotional preparation that not everyone has. And there's also the question of timing. Even with the right person, there's a right time. There are moments when someone is open to deep reflections and moments when they're not. And trying to force depth when the other person doesn't have energy to think seriously is wasting ammunition. So wisdom lies in developing this sensitivity, perceiving when it's worth speaking and when it's worth staying quiet, perceiving who has the capacity to truly understand what you want to share, perceiving who will value your ideas and who will treat them as mere disposable entertainment. Because staying silent isn't weakness. Staying silent is many times the smartest thing you can do. It's preserving your pearls instead of throwing them to pigs. It's protecting your most valuable ideas from contamination and distortion. It's maintaining your mental clarity. Schopenhauer spent years developing his ideas in relative silence. He didn't go around shouting his philosophies in public squares. He wrote, reflected, shared only with those who demonstrated real capacity and interest. And even though this left him lonely, it also kept him focused, kept his ideas pure. And in the end, his ideas found the right people. Not immediately, but eventually. Because deep ideas don't need immediate audience. They need the right audience. So yes, choose your interlocutors well, not out of arrogance, but out of wisdom. Because your mind isn't a public square, it's a private garden, and you have every right to choose who enters. There's a common illusion that afflicts many thinkers. The idea that deep thinking needs public recognition to be valid, that ideas only matter if many people know them, that reflections only have value if they go viral. And this illusion causes an immense amount of unnecessary suffering. Schopenhauer knew something many still haven't learned. Depth doesn't need an audience. Truth doesn't depend on popular approval. Wisdom doesn't lose value from not being widely recognized. In fact, the opposite frequently happens. The deepest ideas flourish precisely away from the spotlight in silence and solitude. Think of the greatest thinkers in history. How many were celebrated in life? Very few. Most were ignored or understood only decades later. And this isn't coincidence. It's pattern. Because truly original ideas are ahead of their time. Schopenhauer is the perfect example of this. He published his main work expecting immediate recognition. What did he receive? Absolute silence. The book didn't sell. Critics ignored him. And for years he lived in the bitterness of this rejection. But here's what matters. His ideas weren't any less true for not being recognized. And eventually, much later, the world caught up to Schopenhauer. His ideas influenced giants like nature. Freud, Jung changed philosophy, psychology, literature. But all this happened without him needing immediate recognition. The value was there, preserved in silence. This lesson is crucial today, especially in an era where everyone measures the value of ideas by the number of likes, where beginning thinkers despair if their texts don't go viral. And so, superficiality wins not by being better, but by being more compatible with the success metric we've chosen. But Schopenhauer would say, ignore these metrics. They don't measure anything important. An idea can have 10 million views and have no depth whatsoever. Meanwhile, a genuinely deep reflection can be read by 3 people and completely change those 3 lives. And there's more. The search for audience corrupts thinking. When you write thinking about how to please the greatest number of people, you automatically simplify, automatically remove nuances, automatically transform depth into palatable surface. Because real depth is difficult, requires effort, and most aren't willing to make that effort. Schopenhauer chose depth over popularity, chose truth over approval, and paid the price for it in loneliness during life, but left a legacy that remains more than 150 years later. While the popular thinkers of his era are completely forgotten because popularity is temporary, depth is permanent. So if you think deeply, if you have original ideas, don't despair about lack of recognition. Don't measure the value of your thinking by the number of people who understand it. Don't abandon depth just because it doesn't generate immediate applause. Keep thinking. Keep reflecting, because depth doesn't need an audience to exist. It just needs you. Living in a noisy world isn't easy. We're constantly bombarded by opinions, news, debates, controversies. It's a constant noise that penetrates from all sides. And this noise has an effect. It confuses. It distracts. It contaminates your ability to think clearly. Schopenhauer understood that preserving your mental lucidity in an environment like this requires active discipline. It's not enough to be intelligent. You need to actively protect your mind from the constant pollution of small thoughts shouted in loud voices. You need to create barriers. You need to choose what comes in and what stays out. Because what happens when you absorb everything that comes your way? You lose your center. You start thinking not with your own categories, but with the categories being pushed onto you. You start worrying about problems that aren't yours. And gradually your mind stops being yours. It becomes a battlefield where others' ideas fight for dominance. And the danger isn't just in bad ideas. It's also in the quantity. Even good ideas in excess can pollute because your mind has limited capacity to process information with depth. When you try to absorb everything, you don't truly absorb anything. You just stay on the surface of 1,000 subjects instead of diving deeply into the few that truly matter. Schopenhauer had a ritual. He drastically limited what he consumed. He didn't read all the newspapers, didn't participate in all debates. He carefully chose what deserved his attention and ignored all the rest. And this wasn't alienation. It was a strategy for mental preservation. Because attention is the most valuable resource you have. Where you place your attention, you place your vital energy. And if you place your attention on 1,000 superficial things, your energy disperses. You're constantly agitated, but never really productive. And there's another danger. Collective noise doesn't just distract, it also influences. Even when you think you're just observing, your mind absorbs. It forms associations, adopts frames, internalizes assumptions, and you don't even notice until one day you express an opinion and realize it didn't come from you. You became an echo without realizing it. Schopenhauer would say that protecting your lucidity requires creating silence, not necessarily physical silence, but mental silence. Regular moments where you disconnect from the collective and reconnect with yourself, where you stop consuming others' opinions and return to generating your own. And this isn't easy today. Requires going against the current, requires resisting the temptation to always be updated, requires accepting that you'll miss debates, will let controversies pass, won't know about things everyone's talking about. But in exchange, you gain something infinitely more valuable, your own mind back. Because in the end, the choice is yours. You can have a noisy mind full of others' thoughts or a silent mind full of your own thoughts. Can be constantly updated on what others think, or deeply connected with what you think. But you can't be both. Schopenhauer chose clarity, chose depth, chose to protect his lucidity, even when it meant appearing disconnected, because he knew his greatest contribution wouldn't come from joining the chorus of screaming voices. It would come from thinking deeply, in silence. And more than 150 years later, he's still being read while the noise of his era has been completely forgotten. So, we've reached the end of this reflection, and if you made it this far, you've probably already realized something important. You're not alone. There are other people who think deeply, who question, who aren't satisfied with ready-made answers. And knowing this already makes a difference because sometimes loneliness is easier to bear when you know it's not just you. Schopenhauer lived this loneliness intensely, but he transformed loneliness into work, transformed isolation into reflection, transformed rejection into philosophy that crosses generations. And the lesson that remains is simple but powerful. Don't diminish yourself to fit in. Don't simplify your thinking to please. Don't trade depth for popularity. Because the world already has too much superficiality. What the world needs is people who think deep, even if it leaves them alone. People who seek truth, even if it makes them unpopular. People who protect their lucidity, even if it requires distancing themselves from collective noise. Be that person. The world won't make it easy, but your own conscience will thank you. If this video made you think, if it resonated with something you already felt, but didn't know how to express, subscribe to the channel and leave your like. Because content like this, that doesn't simplify, that doesn't sell illusions, that respects your intelligence, needs your support to continue existing. And who knows, in the next reflections we'll meet again. Until then, protect your mind, think clearly, and never give up depth. All.